A year after Franklin's passing, a young woman stood before the bench where he used to sit, the one he had lovingly maintained at the community garden. She was holding her father's hand. He looked to be in his 60s. They didn't speak much, but they sat together for nearly an hour. Eventually, the daughter placed a small paper flower beneath the bench. It had a note tucked into its folds. "You helped my father forgive himself. Now he's helping me do the same. Thank you, Franklin." The world didn't change overnight because of Franklin's story, but some worlds did. Small ones, personal ones, the kind that matter most. A man reconciled with his estranged son after 15 years. A widow began writing again, pouring her grief into poetry. A teenager decided not to end his life after reading Franklin's blog. He printed out one post and kept it folded in his wallet for strength. It read, "You don't need to be spectacular to be worthy of love. You just need to be real." Eventually, a small book was compiled. The listeners' letters, a collection of the stories Franklin had received, curated by Ivy with help from volunteers who had known him. It wasn't a bestseller, but it was a soul-seller, passed quietly, hand to hand, left in cafes, slipped into care packages, gifted to people going through divorce, grief, self-doubt. At the beginning of the book, Ivy wrote, "This is not a book of answers. It's a bench, really. Sit, rest, listen, and if you find yourself crying, it means you're still alive. Welcome back." A foundation was started in Franklin's name, not to fund grand causes, but to support community benches in public spaces. Benches with small brass plaques that read, "You matter. Someone is always listening." Every so often, someone would sit on one of those benches and find a letter hidden underneath. Sometimes it was Franklin's words. Sometimes it was someone else's. But always, it was human. Always, it said, "You are not alone." Franklin's granddaughter, whom he'd only met twice before she turned 20, found herself drawn to the kind of life he had built in his final years. She became a therapist and started a podcast called Quiet Voices. The first episode was about Franklin. It was titled, "My Grandfather Wasn't Famous for the Right Reasons." Her voice, soft but resolute, said, "He was admired because he performed. But I loved him because he stopped performing. He showed me that the bravest thing we can do is admit we're lonely, and then let someone in." And so, what remains of Franklin is not statues or awards or business case studies. What remains is a ripple, an echo, a moment of pause in someone's day, a softer voice when someone speaks to their aging parent, a bit more patience in a crowded world, a choice not to chase more, but to be with more, and maybe. If you find yourself walking through a park or sitting on a quiet bench, you'll notice someone beside you, someone lost in thought, maybe. They'll look up and smile, and maybe you'll remember Franklin, not the mogul, not the man on the stage, but the man who once sat quietly, hoping someone would love him for who he was beneath it all. And maybe, just maybe, you'll say something brave, like, "Hi, would you like some company?" Because in the end, it wasn't that Franklin was never loved. It was that he never believed he deserved to be loved without earning it, until he stopped earning and simply received. Final reflections for the viewer. If you've made it this far, thank you, not just for your time, but for your heart. This story was for those who've done everything right and still feel like something is missing. It was for the performers, the fixers, the achievers, the ones who hold everyone else, but forget to hold themselves. It was for you. So tonight, take a breath. Let yourself be loved, not for your resume, not for your roles, but simply for being here. You are enough. You always been enough. You don't need to do more to matter. If this story touched you, please share your thoughts below. Tell us what Franklin's journey stirred in you. Or just write, "I'm listening," because someone else scrolling by may need to know they're not alone. Thank you for joining us on this journey of reflection, grace, and quiet love. Until next time, rest gently. You belong. The spring, Franklin turned 79. A young filmmaker reached out. Her name was Ivy, mid-30s, curious eyes, always scribbling in a notebook. She'd read about his listening hours and followed his blog for over a year. Said his words helped her reconnect with her estranged father. She wanted to make a short film about him, not the mogul, but the man he had become. Franklin hesitated, not out of pride, out of fear. He wasn't used to being looked at that closely unless it was through the lens of success. But Ivy's gaze wasn't evaluative. It was ... patient. She wasn't trying to capture his image. She was trying to understand his heart. The film took weeks. It was simple. Black and white footage. Quiet shots of Franklin making tea. Sitting at the window. Reading strangers' letters. Laughing softly. Standing before his wife's grave with a bouquet of wildflowers. At the end of the film, he said, "People used to clap when I walked on stage. They clapped hard. But you know what I miss? The sound of one person saying my name, slowly, like it mattered." When the film came out, it spread like a slow-burning fire. Not viral in the modern sense, but soul-viral. It wasn't about drama or spectacle. It was about silence, reflection, recognition. A woman in Minnesota commented, "I sent this to my father. We hadn't spoken in 9 years. He called me. We cried. We're seeing each other next week." A nurse in Kansas wrote, "Watch this with a dying patient. He said he finally felt seen." He passed peacefully the next morning. Franklin didn't know how to respond to those messages. He just lit a candle that night and whispered a thank you to the wind. One afternoon, while tidying a drawer, Franklin found a sealed envelope. It was old edges yellowed, Eleanor's handwriting fading. He remembered it. Then she had written it during her illness and told him to open it when he felt ready. He had forgotten. Or maybe, somewhere deep inside, he hadn't been ready. Until now, hands trembling, he opened it. The letter read, "Frank, if you're reading this, I've been quiet for a while, but I never left. You gave the world your strength. But what I loved most was your softness. I know you felt alone even when surrounded by crowds, but please know, being loved quietly is still love. I saw you, every version, and I never looked away. Let the world go now. Let it fade. Earned peace. Yours always, L. Franklin wept. Full-bodied. Not from grief, but from arrival. Because sometimes the thing we search for isn't out there waiting. It's within us. Quietly hoping we'll come home. After that day, Franklin made a habit of reading one letter from a stranger each morning. He didn't respond to all. Some just needed to be heard. He called them his echoes, not noise, not feedback, just the shared sound of a human longing bouncing from one heart to another. He started a new tradition. Once a week, he'd choose a story that moved him deeply. Write the person a handwritten note and mail it with a small stone from the beach where he had found himself again. No return address, just a note that read, "Your life matters. I heard it. I see you." His health, of course, was beginning to decline. Aches turned into stiffness. Words sometimes took longer to find. One evening, after one of his listening hours, he stumbled slightly. Someone rushed to help him. He waved them off, smiled gently, and said, "I'm not afraid of falling anymore. I just don't want to miss anything on the way down." Everyone laughed, but there was a hush in the room afterward because they knew what he meant. That winter, he made a decision. He gave away most of his remaining money, not to charities, though he had supported many, but to people directly, to the old woman who needed a heater for her apartment, to the college kid who wanted to fly home for her father's funeral, to the janitor at the community center who always smiled. Even on the coldest days, Franklin didn't want his wealth to outlive his love. Then, one night, a snowfall softened the world into silence. Franklin wrote his final blog post. It read, "Tonight, I feel full, not of food, not of thoughts, but of something still, something real." If you're reading this, and you've ever wondered if your life touched another, know that it has. It touched mine, and that is enough. With all the quiet love in the world, Franklin, when he passed in his sleep that night, there was no breaking news alert, no headlines. But the next morning, thousands of people shared his post. People from every walk of life. Some he knew. Most he didn't. They left comments like, "Thank you for making me feel real. You made loneliness less lonely. Goodbye, bench builder." His funeral was modest, just how he wanted it. No suits, no speeches, just people sitting in a circle, listening. And now, maybe you're watching this video late at night. Maybe your house is quiet, and something inside you feels the ache Franklin once carried. Let his story remind you, it's not too late to call someone, to write your truth, to listen without fixing, to love without needing applause. Before you go, would love to hear from you. What part of Franklin's story did you feel most deeply? Have you ever been admired, but not loved? Has someone's quiet presence changed your life? Please share in the comments. This space is for souls who still believe in reflection, in kindness, and in the power of shared humanity. Thank you for spending time with us. You were never just a viewer. You were always part of the story. The beach trip changed something in Franklin, not in a sudden, cinematic way, more like how the tide slowly reshapes the shore. When he returned home, the silence of his apartment didn't feel hollow anymore. It felt calm, peaceful, like it was finally ready to hold not just memories, but meaning. He began to write in the mornings. Not a memoir. He didn't think he was that interesting. Just thoughts. Little reflections on the day, the weather, how the light looked on the curtains, or how the soup at the diner reminded him of his mother's kitchen. He'd post them online. A few lines here, a story there. Nothing fancy, but people noticed. A woman from Ohio commented, "Your morning tea post made me cry. My husband used to do the same." A man from Florida said, "I read your note about the quiet street, and I realized I've never listened to mine. I did today." Franklin started getting messages from strangers, not asking for advice, but sharing their lives, their regrets, their hopes, their loneliness. He didn't try to fix it. He just replied, "I hear you. You're not alone. I know that feeling." He didn't know when it happened, but his blog started showing up in grief support groups, mindfulness circles, even in newsletters about aging with dignity. Not because it was clever, but because it was honest. One day, a letter arrived in the mail, an actual letter, handwritten. It was from a woman named Eliza. She said she'd found his blog through her granddaughter. She was 82, recently widowed, and felt invisibilant till she read his story about the lost photograph of his wife. Her letter said, "I've never written to a stranger, but I had to tell you, you helped me cry for the first time in years. Not out of sadness, out of relief. I thought I was the only one carrying an old love in silence. Thank you for giving me permission to feel it again." Franklin pressed the letter to his chest and cried, not because he was sad, because for once he knew his life, his real life, was touching others in a way no trophy ever had. He began organizing monthly listening hours at the community center. No speeches, no rules, just a circle of chairs, tea on the table, and one invitation. Come sit, speak if you want, listen if you'd rather. At first, only a few showed up, mostly older folks who had lost spouses or moved away from family. But week after week, the room grew, not because he advertised it, but because people longed to be heard. One man shared he hadn't spoken to his son in 17 years. A woman said she used to be a school principal and missed being called by her name. A younger girl confessed she didn't know what her grandmother's voice sounded like. She had only ever heard her through hospital machines. Franklin didn't try to give answers. He just kept the kettle warm and listened. That winter, a reporter wrote a piece about him titled, "The Man Who Built Empires and Then Built a Bench for the Weary." It went viral. People around the country began writing in, sharing their own benches, their own quiet acts of love. Someone sent him a photo of a bench in Montana that said, "Sit here. You're already enough." Another in Vermont had a plaque that read, "For all the unsaid things, this bench hears them." Franklin kept a photo wall in his apartment with all the benches. He called it his forest of stillness. But even with all the love, some days were still heavy. There were moments he'd walk past his old office building, now redesigned into a boutique hotel, and feel a pang, not of pride, of distance, like he was walking past someone else's dream. He'd stand across the street, watching young professionals rush in and out, polished, focused, ambitious, and he'd think, they don't know yet. They didn't know the applause would fade, the title would dissolve, the name on the door would be replaced. But maybe, he thought, they'd find their way sooner than he had. Maybe they'd read his story. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, Franklin sat with an old friend on a park bench, one they'd installed in memory of his late wife. Eleanor Dot, the plaque read, "She taught me that love isn't loud. It just never leaves." His friend asked, "Do you miss her still?" Franklin nodded. "Every day. But now I feel her in the spaces between things, in the quiet." The wind picked up. The trees whispered Dot, and Franklin smiled to those watching. This right now, maybe you're someone who spent your life building, achieving, giving, yet wondering why a part of you still feels ... untouched. Maybe people admire you, but you still feel unknown. Franklin's story reminds us that admiration isn't the same as love, that applause doesn't warm you at night, but presence does, gentleness does, being seen does. And here's the thing, it's not too late. It never is, whether you're 75 or 25, whether you've been the CEO, the caretaker, the mother who held everyone together, or the father who always provided but never heard "thank you" out loud. You deserve more than admiration. You deserve connection. If you've ever felt what Franklin felt, like your life was full on paper but hollow in the heart, leave a comment, tell us your story. You never know who might read it and whisper, "Me too." He lived a life people admired but never felt love. You know, some people seem to have it all: the house, the car, the awards on the wall, the kind of life that makes neighbors whisper in admiration, and old classmates lean back with a sigh of envy. That Franklin Whitmore had that kind of life, at least. That's what everyone said. They spoke of him with respect, sometimes even awe. Self-made man, they'd say at the local diner. Built his company from nothing. You couldn't walk down Main Street without seeing something he'd contributed to. He helped rebuild the library after the fire. Sponsored half the scholarships at the high school, and there was even a bench at the park with his name on it. And yet, there was something missing from Franklin's story, not on paper, not in his resume or press clippings, but in the quiet places, in the empty echoes of his kitchen at night, in the way he lingered just a little too long at the end of community gatherings, as if waiting for someone to need him, in the way his voice would grow soft when he said goodbye to people, like he wasn't sure when or if they'd speak to him again. You see, Franklin lived a life that people admired, but he never felt loved. It started early. Franklin was raised in a house that ran like a clock, precise, orderly, and proud. His father, a stern man from the war generation, believed in work over warmth. And his mother, kind but distant, kept the house clean and the children in line. Love wasn't something spoken in his house. It was assumed, implied, coded into structure and routine. So Franklin learned to equate success with approval. The better he did, the more people smiled at him. A perfect report card got him a rare nod from his father. Winning the state science fair earned him a handshake that lasted longer than usual. He grew addicted to achievement, not because he was arrogant, but because it was the closest thing to love he'd ever known. He worked harder than anyone, skipped parties, skipped dances, skipped youth. Really? By 30, he was already the youngest executive at the firm. By 40, he owned it. He told himself he'd settle down later, after the next milestone, after the next big project, after the next deal. But somehow, later kept moving, and the years kept flying. Franklin did try to love. There were women, good women, some strong, some soft. A few who saw past his armor and tried to reach him. But he'd always pull back, not because he didn't care, but because he didn't know how to let someone in when you've built your whole identity around being unshakable. How do you admit that beneath all the awards and titles? There's a boy who never heard the words, "I'm proud of you," without strings attached. He told himself he was protecting them, that he didn't want to burden anyone with his broken pieces. He thought he was being noble, but maybe, deep down, he just didn't believe he deserved it. He had friends, of course, colleagues, acquaintances, golf buddies, people who laughed at his jokes and clinked glasses at charity galas. But real closeness, intimacy, vulnerability, those things felt like foreign languages. He never learned to say, "I need help." Never learned how to cry in front of someone. Never learned how to be held without explaining why. So the years passed, and he kept rising higher, more achievements, more recognition. His name on buildings, his picture in magazines. But at night, in the quiet of his grand home, he'd sometimes sit on the edge of his bed, loosen his tie, and feel nothing, or worse, he'd feel everything he never let himself feel. By the time Franklin turned 70, his life was full of legacy but empty of warmth. People still admired. The mayor once called him the backbone of the town. Students sent him letters thanking him for changing their lives. But no one knew that he spent Christmases alone. No one knew that when he got sick for the first time, a real knock you down kind of illness, he drove himself to the hospital and didn't put anyone's name down as an emergency contact. He just didn't want to bother anyone. He had spent his entire life being the helper, the giver, the strong one. And now, in the sunset of his years, he didn't know how to receive. one afternoon. Franklin was walking through the park, his park. The one where his bench sat by the old willow tree, when he saw a young man sitting there, crying. At first, Franklin hesitated. He wasn't great at emotions, never had been, but something about the boy's slumped shoulders, the quiet heaving of his chest, pulled at something in Franklin's chest that he hadn't felt in years. He sat down beside him, didn't speak for a while, just sat. Eventually, the boy looked up, startled. I didn't mean to take your bench," he stammered, wiping his eyes. Franklin smiled gently. "It's everyone's bench. I just paid for the plaque." The boy laughed a little, despite himself. Franklin didn't ask what was wrong. He just asked, "Want a sandwich?" He had packed too. He always did, even though no one ever joined him that day. Someone did. That small moment changed something in Franklin. He started visiting the park more often, started bringing extra food, extra blankets in the winter, books for the little free library box, and he started listening, not fixing, not lecturing, just listening. It was new for him, strange even, to be present without needing to impress. But the more he did it, the more he began to feel something he hadn't felt in decades. Connection, not the kind that comes with status or prestige, but the kind that comes from seeing and being seen. He started mentoring a few young men who reminded him of himself. Brilliant, driven, a little lonely, and he told them the truth, that success without love is just a well-decorated cage. Franklin never married, never had children of his own, but by the time he turned 80, he had more sons and daughters than he could count. They came to his house on weekends, helped with chores, brought him soup when he caught a cold, and on his 81st birthday, they threw him a party at the community center. Hundreds showed up, not to honor his career or his donations, but to thank him for seeing them, loving them. Listening. One of the young men stood up at the end and said, "Franklin taught me that it's never too late to start living with your heart open. That even if you've lived a whole life behind walls, you can still take them down, one brick at a time." Franklin cried openly, and for the first time in his life, we didn't feel ashamed of his tears. If you've made it this far, thank you. Truly, this story was never really just about Franklin. It's about so many of us, the ones who did everything right, built lives that others admired, followed the rules, worked hard, provided, but still quietly wonder, why does it feel like something's missing? Maybe it's not too late. Maybe connection is still possible. Maybe your story can still change direction. If this story touched something in you, leave a comment, share a memory, a regret, a hope, and if you'd like to hear more stories like this ones that speak softly but deeply, consider subscribing. We're building something gentle here, something honest, and you're very welcome to be part of it.